War crimes aren't just committed by dictators. They're committed by the most powerful nations on Earth. Nations that write the rules of war, then quietly break them. These are 7 war crimes committed by major world powers. But history tells a different story. Some of the worst war crimes in modern history were carried out by the most powerful nations on Earth. Nations with advanced militaries, nations that helped write the international rules of war, and then quietly broke them. Today, this isn't about picking sides or assigning blame. It's not about politics. It's about documented events that changed how we understand power and accountability. These are some of the most serious war crimes committed by major world powers. And what happened to those responsible? Case 1. Russia. Chechnya filtration camps. During the Chechen Wars, Russian forces established what they called filtration camps. The official purpose was to identify suspected militants. The reality was far darker. Civilians, including women, teenagers, and the elderly, were detained without formal charges, without lawyers, without trials. Survivors who made it out told the same stories. Beatings with cables and rifle butts. Electric shocks applied to fingers, ears, genitals. Mock executions where prisoners were told they would die, just to break them psychologically. Rape, starvation, freezing conditions. And then, people simply disappeared. Families searched for months, sometimes years. Bodies were often never found. Human rights groups documented thousands passing through these camps. Memorial, a Russian human rights organization, collected hundreds of testimonies. The European Court of Human Rights ruled, multiple times, that Russia had violated the European Convention on Human Rights. Despite international condemnation, no senior Russian officials were held accountable. Some commanders were promoted. The camps operated for years. The pattern of impunity was already clear. Case 2. United States. My Lai Massacre. March 16, 1968. The Vietnam War. American soldiers entered the village of My Lai in South Vietnam. They were part of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment. They had been told the village harbored Viet Cong fighters. Instead, they found unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. What followed was a massacre. Over the course of 4 hours, soldiers systematically killed villagers. Families were herded into ditches and shot. Women were raped before being executed. Children were bayoneted. Babies were killed. Houses were burned. Livestock was slaughtered. The entire village was destroyed. Over 500 civilians were killed. A U.S. Army helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson Jr., saw what was happening from the air. He landed his helicopter between the soldiers and fleeing villagers. He ordered his door gunner to fire on American troops if they continued killing. He rescued civilians, and he reported the massacre. The massacre was covered up for over a year. The Army initially reported it as a military victory. Only after investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the truth did the world learn what happened. 26 soldiers were charged. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. His sentence was reduced multiple times. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. Then he was released on parole. He was never pardoned, but he walked free. Case 3. United Kingdom. Kenya Mau Mau camps, the 1950s. British colonial rule in Kenya. An anti-colonial uprising known as the Mau Mau Rebellion had begun. The British response was brutal and systematic. Thousands of Kenyans, mostly Kikuyu people, were detained in what can only be described as concentration camps. Over 150,000 people passed through the detention system. Inside those camps, detainees were beaten with clubs and whips, forced to perform hard labor in quarries and on roads, subjected to starvation rations. Women were raped. Men were castrated. In some camps, prisoners were forced to eat feces. Guards used pliers to crush testicles. Electric shocks were common. British colonial documents later revealed this wasn't the work of rogue soldiers acting alone. It was policy. Orders came from the top. For decades, the British government hid the records. Thousands of documents were destroyed. Others were hidden in secret archives. Only in 2011, over 50 years later, did historians uncover evidence in government files. In 2013, the British government formally acknowledged the torture. They agreed to pay compensation to over 5,000 survivors. But many had already died, waiting for justice that came too late. Case 4. France. Algerian War Torture. During Algeria's War for Independence from 1954 to 1962, French forces faced a growing insurgency. Their response included widespread and systematic torture. Not a few isolated incidents. Not rogue soldiers acting alone. Policy. French paratroopers used a method called la gégène, electric shocks delivered through field telephones. Electrodes were attached to ears, fingers, genitals. Victims convulsed and screamed. Water torture, known as the bathtub, involved near drowning. Suspects were beaten with clubs and boots, hung from ceilings. Many were executed after interrogation and buried in unmarked graves. Civilians were detained without trial. Entire neighborhoods were rounded up. People disappeared. French officials denied it for decades. They called reports propaganda. They said it was necessary to fight terrorism. Only years later did French generals admit the truth. General Jacques Massacre acknowledged torture was routine. In 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron formally acknowledged that torture was systematic during the war. But full accountability never came. Case 5. Japan, Unit 731. During World War II, Imperial Japan operated a covert biological and chemical warfare research program. It was called Unit 731. Based in Manchuria, China, this unit conducted human experimentation on a massive scale. Prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Koreans, Russians, and Allied POWs, were used as test subjects. They weren't called prisoners. They were called logs. They were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax. Researchers studied how long it took them to die. Prisoners were subjected to vivisection, dissection, while still alive, without anesthesia. Organs were removed while hearts were still beating. Limbs were amputated to study blood loss. Some were frozen alive to test frostbite treatments. Others were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out. Flamethrowers were tested on living humans. Thousands died. Estimates range from 3,000 to over 200,000. After the war, the United States granted immunity to the scientists in exchange for their research data. Unit 731's commander, Shiro Ishii, never faced trial. He lived freely in Japan until his death in 1959. Many of his colleagues went on to successful careers. Some even received government honors. Case 6. USSR. Chechnya Massacre. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had divided Poland between them. Soviet secret police executed over 22,000 Polish officers, police, and intellectuals. They were shot, buried in mass graves in the Chechnya forest. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed Nazi Germany. They produced reports, held press conferences, maintained the lie for nearly 50 years. Only in 1990 did the Soviet government finally admit the truth. By then, most witnesses were dead. Families who had waited decades for answers finally learned who was responsible. But real accountability remained symbolic. Case 7. Belgium. Congo Free State atrocities. Late 19th century. Central Africa. What was known as the Congo Free State was not a colony. It was the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Congolese civilians were forced into labor to extract rubber and ivory. Failure to meet quotas was punished brutally. Villages were burned. Hostages were taken. Men, women, and children were mutilated. Hands were severed to prove bullets had not been wasted. Entire families were executed to terrorize others into compliance. Missionaries and diplomats documented the abuses. Photographs showed piles of severed limbs, starving children, empty villages. Historians estimate that up to 10 million people died due to violence, famine, and forced labor. No one was ever criminally prosecuted. Leopold II died wealthy and unpunished. Act 3. Resolution: 7 cases, 7 countries, spanning over a century. Different wars, different continents, different political systems. But the same pattern emerges every time. War crimes are documented, evidence is collected, international law is cited, and then impunity. The soldiers who pull the trigger sometimes face consequences, but the commanders who give the orders, the policymakers who create the conditions, they walk free. These stories aren't told to rewrite history. They're told to remember it, because remembering is the first step to preventing the next tragedy. And this is only part 1